You finish saying something simple, a perfectly reasonable thing, and then you keep going. You add context that wasn't asked for. You explain your reasoning. You offer a backup justification in case the first one didn't land. You mention the exception. You clarify the clarification. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, you notice the other person's face shift, just slightly, and you think, I'm doing it again. It's not nervousness exactly. It's something more specific than that. Something that feels almost involuntary, like your mind won't let the thought rest until it's been fully accounted for, until every possible misunderstanding has been preemptively addressed, until the other person couldn't possibly walk away with the wrong impression. Most people would call this over-explaining, and most people treat it like a quirk, a bad habit, something to just stop doing. But here's the thing. The people who over-explain almost never do it because they love the sound of their own voice. They do it because something deeper is running in the background, something that has almost nothing to do with the words coming out of their mouth and almost everything to do with what they're afraid might happen if the words aren't enough. This is about that. What's actually happening, psychologically, when someone can't seem to let a thought land without reinforcing it, where it comes from, what it means, and why understanding it might be the most useful thing you've ever done with this pattern. Let's start with what it looks like from the outside, and then what it actually feels like from the inside. From the outside, over-explaining can look like rambling. It can look like defensiveness or insecurity, or someone who just can't get to the point. Those are fair observations, but they're surface-level reads of something that operates at a much deeper layer. From the inside, it feels almost compulsive, like there's a gap between what you said and how you need the other person to understand, and your mind keeps generating more words to close that gap. It's not that you don't trust yourself. It's more like you don't trust the space between what you said and how it will be received. That space feels dangerous somehow, unpredictable. And so you fill it with context, with caveats, with preemptive defenses. What's interesting is that this pattern rarely shows up randomly. It tends to intensify in specific situations, when you're being evaluated, when there's a chance of being misunderstood, when the other person has power over how you're perceived, or when the stakes feel high in some way, even if you couldn't immediately explain why. That specificity is a clue, because it tells you that over-explaining isn't really about the words. It's a response to something, a strategy, an unconscious one, for managing a particular kind of threat. The question is, what threat? Here's where it gets interesting. Psychologists who study what's called approval motivation, the psychological drive to be understood and positively regarded by others, have found that people who score high in this trait don't just want to be liked. They experience a kind of low-level anxiety when there's ambiguity about how they're being perceived. And that anxiety isn't irrational. It's learned. It developed because at some earlier point, being misunderstood had real consequences. Think about what over-explaining actually does in the moment. It removes ambiguity. It closes interpretive gaps. It makes it harder for the other person to walk away with a version of you that you didn't intend to present. On a psychological level, it's a control strategy. Not control over other people, but control over perception. And that's a crucial distinction. People who over-explain often grew up in environments where being misread was genuinely costly, where their intentions were regularly questioned, where they had to explain themselves to be believed or justified or not punished. The nervous system learns from that. It decides, very rationally, that the safest thing to do is to over-communicate, to leave nothing open to interpretation, to make the case before anyone has a chance to rule against you. Now consider this. That strategy works, at least when you're young. It reduces misunderstandings. It keeps you safe from certain kinds of judgment. The problem is that the brain keeps using it long after the original environment is gone. It becomes your default, even in conversations that carry no real threat at all. Psychologists call this schema overgeneralization, when a coping strategy that was adaptive in one context gets applied indiscriminately to every context that feels even slightly similar. And the feeling of being evaluated, even casually, is often enough to trigger it. There's a substantial body of research that helps explain this, and it points in a direction most people don't expect. Studies on what researchers call communication anxiety consistently show that people who over-communicate in conversations are not simply more talkative or more extroverted. In fact, many of them score toward the introverted end of personality spectrums. What they share is not a love of talking, it's a heightened sensitivity to being misunderstood. A landmark study in social cognition found that people who experience what's called
high self-monitoring, meaning they pay careful, ongoing attention to how they're being perceived, report a persistent sense that their self-presentation is incomplete, that there's always more to convey, that the version of themselves the other person is receiving might be missing something important. This isn't vanity. It's closer to hypervigilance, a kind of exhausting attentional bias toward the gap between who you are and who you appear to be. But there's another layer. Research in developmental psychology, the study of how people develop psychologically through childhood and adolescence, has identified something called anxious attachment as a significant predictor of over-explanation in adult communication. People who, early in life, experienced inconsistent emotional responsiveness from caregivers, meaning sometimes their needs were met and sometimes they weren't, without clear logic, tend to develop a communication style that tries to cover every base, because they learned that ambiguity is risky, that leaving something unclear might mean not getting what they need. What's striking about that finding is this. It means the pattern isn't a personality flaw. It's a learned survival strategy, one that made perfect sense in the context where it was born, and one that the brain, being the efficient pattern matcher that it is, has continued to deploy ever since.
Here's the part most people miss. Over-explaining is typically framed as a communication problem, something to fix in how you talk to people. And there are, yes, practical reasons why it can complicate relationships or make conversations feel heavier than they need to be. But framing it purely as a communication flaw misses the deeper thing it reveals about how a person relates to the world. People who over-explain often carry a very specific belief, usually one they've never fully articulated, that they are somehow harder to understand than other people, that the default version of themselves is insufficient, that they need to provide more context, more justification, more evidence of their reasoning just to be received the way they intend. And they've gotten so practiced at doing this that it no longer feels like anxiety, it just feels like being thorough. Think about what that means. It means a significant portion of their cognitive energy in any given conversation isn't going toward the conversation itself. It's going toward the meta layer, the ongoing management of perception. That's exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to someone who doesn't do it. It's not that the conversation is tiring, it's that you're simultaneously having the conversation and running a background process that's constantly evaluating whether you're being understood correctly. What's fascinating is that this pattern often coexists with high intelligence, not because smart people are more anxious, but because a mind that can anticipate multiple interpretations of a single statement will naturally want to address all of them. The same cognitive trait that makes someone insightful, thorough, and precise can also make them feel like they can never say enough. Every clarification generates another potential misreading to preemptively address. And that's the loop. A mind that is genuinely good at seeing complexity ends up exhausted by the complexity it can see in its own communication. Now, consider this differently. What if over-explaining isn't a communication failure, but a reflection of someone who cares deeply about being understood, someone for whom being genuinely known by another person is not a small thing?
The strange thing about over-explaining, once you understand it, is that it starts to look like a form of longing. Not a flaw, not a bad habit, but a reflection of how much it means to someone to be truly received by another person. The person who over-explains isn't trying to dominate a conversation. They're trying to close the distance between how they are on the inside and how they appear on the outside. They're trying to be known. That's a very human thing to want. And somewhere along the way, they learned that wanting it wasn't enough, that they had to work for it, that understanding didn't happen automatically. It had to be earned, built, justified, explained into existence. That belief that understanding has to be earned is almost always where this started. And the good news, if you're someone who recognizes yourself here, is that beliefs like this can be examined. They don't have to run in the background forever. Noticing that the strategy exists is already a form of freedom from it, because you can start to ask, is this conversation actually one where I need to over-explain, or am I importing an old fear into a new moment? You don't have to solve this all at once, but you can start to give yourself permission to let a thought land, to let a sentence end without immediately reinforcing it, to trust gradually that the version of you that shows up in the words you've already said might be enough, that the gap between you and how you're understood is smaller than it feels, that the work you've always done to be understood has in fact been doing its job. You've been understood more than you know. The over-explaining didn't come from nowhere. It came from a real experience. It came from caring. It came from paying close attention to how you're received in a world where that felt important, because it was important once. You're not difficult to understand. You just learned very early to act as if you might be. If this resonated with you, if something in this felt like it was describing a version of yourself you haven't quite had words for before, that recognition itself is worth something. It means you're the kind of person who's been paying attention to other people, to conversations, to the distance between what you feel and what you manage to express. That kind of attentiveness is rare, and it's worth understanding.